The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Donald Trump stepped out of his armored limousine. The year was 2019, and he was in London for a state visit that had already stirred controversy across both sides of the Atlantic. Trump adjusted his red tie and smoothed down his distinctive hair, knowing that cameras were capturing every moment of his arrival. The palace grounds buzzed with activity as staff members hurried to ensure everything was perfect for the American president's visit. Protocol officers whispered last-minute instructions to one another, while security teams maintained their watchful positions throughout the area. This was no ordinary diplomatic meeting. It was a carefully choreographed dance between two of the world's most powerful nations. Standing at attention near the main entrance was Guardsman James Wellington, a member of the Queen's Guard who had served with distinction for over 8 years. Wellington was a towering figure at 6 feet 4 inches, his red tunic immaculate and his bearskin hat positioned with military precision. His face remained expressionless, as required by centuries of tradition, but his eyes were alert and focused. Wellington had guarded some of the most important people in the world during his service. He had stood watch during visits from presidents, prime ministers, and royalty from dozens of nations. Each visitor had shown appropriate respect for the protocols and traditions that governed interactions with the Queen's Guard. Today, he expected nothing different. As Trump approached the entrance, surrounded by his entourage of advisors, security personnel, and media handlers, he noticed the stoic guard standing at his post. The president had always been fascinated by displays of military ceremony, and the sight of the perfectly uniformed guardsman caught his attention immediately. "Look at this guy," Trump said to his chief of staff, who was walking beside him. "Standing there like a statue. That's real discipline right there." The chief of staff nodded politely, hoping his boss would simply continue walking toward their scheduled meeting with palace officials. But Trump had other ideas brewing in his mind. He had always believed that his position as President of the United States commanded respect wherever he went, and he saw no reason why that should be different here. The president slowed his pace as he drew closer to Wellington's position. The guardsman remained motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. His rifle was held at the perfect angle, and not a single element of his uniform was out of place. To most observers, he appeared to be simply another part of the palace's impressive ceremonial display. But Wellington was much more than a ceremonial figure. Born in Scotland, he had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather, who had served in the same regiment during World War II. His family had a proud tradition of military service that stretched back generations. After completing his education, Wellington had enlisted with the specific goal of joining the Queen's Guard, drawn by the honor and responsibility that came with protecting the royal family. His training had been intense and demanding. Beyond the obvious requirements of physical fitness and military bearing, guards were taught the intricate details of palace protocol, the history of their regiment, and the proper procedures for countless different scenarios. They learned when to move and when to remain still, when to speak and when to maintain silence, and how to handle interactions with everyone from curious tourists to visiting dignitaries. One of the most important lessons drummed into every member of the Queen's Guard was the chain of command. They served the crown, and their loyalty was to Queen Elizabeth II above all others. While they were expected to be courteous to visiting officials, they were never to compromise their duties or abandon their protocols for anyone, regardless of their position or nationality. As Trump continued his approach, several palace staff members began to look nervous. They recognized the expression on the American president's face. It was the same look he wore when he was about to do something spontaneous and potentially problematic. His reputation for unpredictable behavior had preceded him to London, and everyone involved in organizing the visit had hoped to avoid any diplomatic incidents. The president's security detail remained close, but tried to appear relaxed. They had learned to be ready for anything when it came to Trump's interactions with foreign officials and ceremonial figures, Some of them exchanged subtle glances, silently communicating their shared concern about what might happen next. Meanwhile, British protocol officers who were monitoring the arrival began to tense up. They had spent weeks preparing for this visit, going over every detail to ensure that everything would proceed smoothly. The last thing anyone wanted was for the president to create a scene that would dominate headlines and potentially damage diplomatic relations. Trump came to a complete stop directly in front of Wellington, studying the guardsman with obvious interest. The president had always been drawn to displays of power and authority, and he saw the Queen's Guard as symbols of the kind of respect and deference he believed he deserved everywhere he went. "Magnificent," Trump said loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear. "Just magnificent. You can see the discipline, the training. This is what real military bearing looks like." Wellington remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on a point somewhere beyond Trump's shoulder. According to his training, visiting dignitaries were part of the background noise he was expected to ignore while maintaining his watch. The guardsman had encountered countless attempts by tourists and officials to get him to break character over the years, and he had never wavered in his commitment to his duties. The president seemed pleased by what he interpreted as a sign of respect. In his mind, the guard's rigid attention was a tribute to his own importance and authority. Trump had always believed that military personnel naturally recognized and responded to strong leadership, and he saw Wellington's behavior as confirmation of that belief. "You know," Trump said to his entourage, speaking loudly enough to ensure that the gathered media could capture his words, "this is exactly the kind of respect that the office of the president should command everywhere. Look at how this soldier stands at attention in my presence." Several of his advisors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the potential for misunderstanding in the president's comments. They knew that the guard's behavior had nothing to do with Trump specifically and everything to do with his training and duties, but they also knew that trying to correct their boss in public would only make the situation worse. British officials who were watching from a discreet distance began to exchange worried looks. They could see where this interaction was heading, and none of them liked the possibilities. The Queen's Guard had a reputation for maintaining their composure and following protocol regardless of circumstances, but they had never been tested by someone quite like Donald Trump. The president took another step closer to Wellington, now standing just a few feet away from the guardsman. At this distance, Trump could see every detail of the guard's uniform and equipment. He noticed the gleaming brass buttons, the perfect creases in the fabric, and the way the morning light reflected off the polished leather of Wellington's boots. "Soldier," Trump said in his most authoritative voice, the same tone he used when addressing military personnel back in the United States. "I want you to show me a proper salute, the kind of salute that the President of the United States deserves." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Wellington's training had prepared him for many situations, but being directly commanded by a foreign leader was not something that had been covered in any manual. The guardsman remained motionless, his face showing no reaction to the president's demand. Trump waited for several seconds, expecting immediate compliance with his order. In his experience, military personnel always responded quickly to direct commands from superior authority figures. When nothing happened, his expression began to change from confident expectation to puzzled irritation. "Did you hear me, soldier?" Trump said more loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I said I want to see a salute, a proper military salute for your commander-in-chief." The phrase commander-in-chief caused several British officials to wince visibly. Trump was indeed the commander-in-chief of American military forces, but he held no such authority over British troops. The Queen's Guard answered to an entirely different chain of command, one that had been established centuries before the United States even existed as a nation. Wellington continued to stare straight ahead, his rifle held at the precise angle required by regulations. Inside his head, the guardsman was running through his training, remembering the countless hours of instruction about proper protocol and appropriate responses to various situations. Nowhere in that training was there any provision for taking orders from foreign officials, regardless of their rank or position. The president's face was beginning to show signs of real annoyance now. He was accustomed to immediate responses when he gave orders, and Wellington's continued silence was starting to feel like a personal insult. Trump glanced around at the gathered crowd, aware that dozens of cameras were recording every moment of this interaction. "This soldier needs to learn some respect," Trump said to his chief of staff, his voice carrying a clear edge of displeasure. "When the President of the United States asks for a salute, you give a salute. That's basic military courtesy." The chief of staff cleared his throat nervously, trying to think of a way to diffuse the situation without embarrassing his boss. But before he could speak, one of the British protocol officers stepped forward with a polite but firm expression on his face. "Mr. President," the officer said carefully, "perhaps I could explain the situation regarding our ceremonial guards and their specific duties during your visit." Trump turned toward the British official with an expression that suggested he was not interested in explanations or excuses. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted when he wanted it, and he saw this moment as a test of his authority and prestige on the international stage. The tension in the courtyard was becoming palpable as more people became aware of what was happening. Palace staff members, who had been going about their duties, now found themselves stealing glances at the unfolding scene. Security personnel from both countries remained alert, but tried to appear casual, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding. Wellington, for his part, continued to embody the discipline and commitment that had made the Queen's Guard legendary throughout the world. He understood that he was at the center of an increasingly uncomfortable diplomatic moment, but his duty was clear. He served the crown, not any foreign leader, regardless of their position or expectations. The morning sun continued to shine down on Buckingham Palace, but the atmosphere in the courtyard had grown decidedly chilly. What should have been a routine ceremonial arrival was turning into something much more complicated, with the potential to create headlines and diplomatic complications that neither country particularly wanted. As the standoff continued, it became clear that something would have to give. Trump was not the kind of person who backed down from confrontations, especially not in front of cameras and reporters. Wellington was bound by centuries of tradition and training that left no room for compromise. And somewhere in the palace, Queen Elizabeth II was preparing for a meeting that was already shaping up to be more interesting than anyone had anticipated. The British protocol officer, Sir Michael Harrington, had served in diplomatic roles for over 2 decades and had navigated countless delicate situations involving visiting heads of state. However, he had never encountered anything quite like this moment. Standing before him was the most powerful man in the world, demanding that a Queen's Guard abandon centuries of protocol to satisfy what appeared to be a wounded ego. "Mr. President," Sir Michael began diplomatically, "I believe there may be some confusion about the role and duties of Her Majesty's Guard. These gentlemen serve under very specific protocols that have been established over many centuries." Trump's eyes narrowed as he looked at the British official. He was clearly not interested in lengthy explanations about historical protocols. In his mind, the situation was simple. He was the President of the United States, and that should command respect from military personnel anywhere in the world. "I don't care about your protocols," Trump replied curtly. "What I care about is proper respect for the office I represent. This soldier should salute when a president asks for a salute. That's basic military courtesy, and I expect it to be followed." The gathered media representatives were now fully focused on the unfolding drama. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's increasingly frustrated expression, while reporters began typing furiously on their phones and tablets. This was exactly the kind of unpredictable moment that made covering Trump such a challenging assignment. Wellington remained statue-like throughout this exchange, his breathing so controlled that his chest barely moved beneath his red tunic. He could hear every word being spoken around him. But his training required him to maintain his focus and composure regardless of external distractions. The guardsmen had been in similar situations before, though never with such high-profile participants. Sir Michael glanced toward other palace officials, hoping for support in diffusing this situation. He could see concern written on their faces, but he also knew that everyone was looking to him to handle this delicate moment without creating an international incident. "Mr. President," Sir Michael tried again, "perhaps we could discuss this matter privately, and I could explain the specific traditions that govern our ceremonial guards." But Trump was beyond the point of being interested in private discussions. He was now fully committed to this public test of wills, and backing down would feel like admitting defeat in front of the world's media. The president took another step closer to Wellington, bringing himself within arm's reach of the guardsman. "Soldier, I'm going to ask you one more time," Trump said in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "Give me the salute that the President of the United States deserves. That's an order." The word order sent a visible shudder through the crowd of British officials. Using military command language with a member of the Queen's Guard was crossing a line that even the most patient diplomats found difficult to ignore. Several of them exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared dismay at how the situation was developing. Wellington's superior officer, Captain Robert Ashford, was watching from a position about 50 yards away. Ashford had been monitoring the interaction since it began, initially assuming it would be a brief moment of presidential curiosity about British military traditions. Now he realized that intervention might become necessary to protect both the integrity of the Queen's Guard and the diplomatic relationship between the two nations. Captain Ashford began walking slowly toward the group, his own military bearing evident in every step. He had served with distinction in Afghanistan and Iraq before being assigned to ceremonial duties at the palace. Unlike Wellington, his role allowed him much more flexibility in how he could interact with visiting dignitaries. As Ashford approached, Trump noticed the officer's movement and turned his attention toward him. The president was clearly hoping that someone with authority was finally coming to resolve this situation in his favor. "Officer," Trump called out as Ashford drew near, "I need you to explain to this soldier that when the President of the United States requests a salute, it should be given immediately. This is basic military protocol." Captain Ashford came to a stop at a respectful distance and executed a crisp salute toward Trump. It was a gesture of courtesy rather than subservience, but the president seemed pleased by this display of what he interpreted as proper military respect. "Mr. President," Ashford said in a clear, professional voice, "I am Captain Robert Ashford, and I have the honor of commanding this guard detail today. I believe I can help clarify the situation we find ourselves in." Trump's expression brightened slightly, assuming that this officer would now order his subordinate to comply with the presidential request. The president had always believed that military hierarchies operated the same way everywhere, with orders flowing down from the top without question or hesitation. "Excellent," Trump said with satisfaction. "Captain, I want you to order this soldier to give me a proper military salute. I think there's been some confusion about chain of command here." Captain Ashford maintained his professional demeanor, but those who knew him well would have detected the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was choosing his words very carefully. "Mr. President, with the greatest respect, I believe the confusion may be about the nature of our service and our chain of command. Guardsman Wellington serves Her Majesty the Queen, and his protocols are established by centuries of British military tradition." The phrase, "serves Her Majesty the Queen," seemed to strike Trump as particularly problematic. In his worldview, American presidential authority was supreme, and the idea that any military personnel would prioritize allegiance to someone else was difficult for him to accept. "Captain, I don't think you understand," Trump said, his voice rising slightly. I am the President of the United States of America. I am the Commander-in-Chief of the most powerful military in the world. When I ask for a salute, I expect to receive one." Captain Ashford had anticipated this moment during his walk across the courtyard. He had quickly considered various approaches to the situation, weighing the need to maintain diplomatic courtesy against his duty to protect the traditions and integrity of the Queen's Guard. "Mr. President," Ashford replied carefully, "I have enormous respect for your office and for the military forces you command. However, Guardsman Wellington and I serve under a different authority. We are sworn to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and our protocols reflect that allegiance." The word allegiance seemed to particularly irritate Trump. He had always struggled with the concept that there might be loyalties and authorities that superseded his own, especially when it came to military matters. Sir Michael Harrington decided that this was the moment to provide more context, hoping to help the president understand the situation without further escalating tensions. "Mr. President," Sir Michael interjected, "what Captain Ashford is explaining is that the Queen's Guard operates under royal prerogative which predates most modern governmental structures. These traditions are deeply woven into British constitutional monarchy." Trump turned toward Sir Michael with an expression of growing impatience. He was clearly not interested in constitutional explanations or historical context. What he wanted was simple compliance with what he saw as a reasonable request from someone in a position of ultimate authority. "I don't care about your constitutional monarchy," Trump said bluntly. "What I care about is respect, and right now, I'm not seeing the respect that the American presidency deserves." The comment about constitutional monarchy caused several British officials to exchange meaningful glances. They were beginning to realize that this was not simply a misunderstanding about protocol, it was a fundamental clash between different concepts of authority and respect. Captain Ashford recognized that the situation required a more direct approach. He had hoped that diplomatic language and careful explanations would resolve the matter, but Trump's persistence suggested that only a clear statement of position would suffice. "Mr. President," Ashford said with firm politeness, "I want to be absolutely clear about our position. Guardsman Wellington and I serve the Crown. We do not take orders from foreign officials, regardless of their rank or position. This is not a matter of disrespect. It is a matter of duty and constitutional obligation." The word foreign visibly struck Trump like a physical blow. Throughout his presidency, he had grown accustomed to being treated as the most important person in any room, and being categorized as a foreign official felt like a significant diminishment of his status. "Foreign official?" Trump repeated, his voice carrying clear indignation. "I am the President of the United States. I am your most important ally. I deserve better treatment than this." Wellington continued to maintain his perfect military bearing throughout this increasingly heated exchange. His years of training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation, remaining focused on his duties while chaos swirled around him. Other guards positioned throughout the courtyard were also maintaining their posts, creating a striking visual contrast between the emotional volatility of the argument and the calm professionalism of the Queen's Guard. Members of Trump's own entourage were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Several advisors stepped closer to the president, hoping to find an opportunity to suggest that it might be time to move on to the scheduled meetings inside the palace. But Trump was now fully invested in winning this confrontation. In his mind, this had become a test of American prestige and his personal authority. Backing down would feel like admitting weakness on the international stage, something he was unwilling to do regardless of the consequences. "Captain," Trump said, his voice taking on a more threatening tone, "I think you need to reconsider your position here. The United States is Britain's most important ally. We provide security guarantees, trade relationships, and diplomatic support that your country depends on." I would think that would earn some basic military courtesy. This veiled reference to American power and British dependence caused Captain Ashford's expression to harden slightly. While he remained professional in his demeanor, it was clear that Trump's comments had touched a nerve regarding British sovereignty and independence. "Mr. President," Ashford replied with quiet steel in his voice, "Britain's alliance with the United States is indeed valuable and important, but that alliance has never required us to abandon our constitutional principles or our military traditions. The Queen's Guard has maintained its independence and integrity for centuries, through wars, political changes, and countless diplomatic challenges." The reference to centuries of tradition seemed to particularly frustrate Trump, who had always been more interested in immediate results than historical context. He was accustomed to business environments where power and leverage could quickly change the terms of any negotiation. Sir Michael Harrington realized that the situation was rapidly approaching a point where diplomatic intervention might no longer be sufficient. He could see palace security personnel beginning to position themselves more strategically around the courtyard, and he knew that both British and American security teams were growing concerned about the escalating tensions. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the shadows that had initially provided some visual drama to the scene were beginning to shorten. But the metaphorical shadows hanging over this diplomatic encounter were growing longer and darker with each passing moment. As the confrontation continued to unfold, it was becoming clear that this was more than just a misunderstanding about military protocol. It was a clash between different concepts of authority, respect, and national sovereignty that would have implications far beyond this single moment in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Inside Buckingham Palace, Queen Elizabeth II was being briefed about the unusual situation developing in her courtyard. At 93 years old, she had witnessed countless diplomatic incidents, political crises, and international confrontations during her long reign. However, the report she was receiving from her private secretary was unlike anything she had encountered in decades of hosting world leaders. "Your Majesty," the private secretary said carefully, "it appears that President Trump is having a disagreement with Captain Ashford and Guardsman Wellington regarding military protocols. The situation has been ongoing for several minutes and shows no signs of resolution." The Queen, dressed in a pale blue dress suit and her signature pearl necklace, listened to the briefing with the calm attention she had perfected over 7 decades of royal duties. She had been preparing for a formal meeting with the American president, but it was becoming clear that more immediate intervention might be necessary. "I see," the Queen replied in her measured voice. "And what exactly is the nature of this disagreement?" "The President appears to be requesting that Guardsman Wellington provide him with a military salute, Your Majesty. Our people have explained that this falls outside the Guard's protocols, but the President has been quite insistent on the matter." Queen Elizabeth had dealt with difficult and demanding world leaders throughout her reign. She had hosted Soviet premiers during the Cold War, navigated tensions with various American presidents, and managed countless diplomatic challenges with grace and firmness. Her approach had always been to combine royal dignity with practical problem-solving. "I believe this situation requires a direct approach," the Queen said decisively. "Please inform the President that I would like to speak with him immediately." Meanwhile, in the courtyard, the confrontation was reaching a critical point. Trump's frustration was becoming increasingly visible, and his language was growing more pointed with each exchange. "Captain, I'm going to be very direct with you," Trump said, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. "The United States has been protecting Britain for decades. Our nuclear umbrella, our military support, our intelligence sharing, all of that gives us certain expectations about how we should be treated. I think a simple salute is a very small thing to ask for in return." Captain Ashford's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but Trump's continued references to American power and British dependence were testing his patience. The suggestion that British military traditions should be compromised in exchange for American support was particularly galling. Mr. President, Ashford replied with careful control, Britain's alliance with the United States is indeed important, but it has never been a relationship of subservience. The Queen's Guard serves the Crown, not foreign powers, regardless of their military or economic strength. Trump was now standing directly in front of Wellington, close enough to see the guardsman's steady breathing and the small beads of perspiration that had formed on his brow despite the cool morning air. The president seemed to interpret the guard's continued silence as a form of defiance rather than adherence to protocol. "Soldier," Trump said directly to Wellington, bypassing both Captain Ashford and the British officials. "I know you can hear me. I know you understand what I'm asking for. All I want is the basic respect that any military person should show to the Commander-in-Chief of America's armed forces." For the first time since the encounter began, Wellington's eyes flickered slightly. It was a barely perceptible movement, but Captain Ashford noticed it immediately. The guardsman was being placed in an impossible position, maintaining his protocols while being directly challenged by one of the most powerful people in the world. At that moment, a new voice cut through the tension in the courtyard with unmistakable authority. "Mr. President?" Everyone turned to see Queen Elizabeth II herself, walking across the courtyard with her characteristic measured pace. She was accompanied by two of her personal protection officers, but her bearing made it clear that she was in complete control of the situation. The Queen had decided that this matter required her direct intervention. Trump's expression immediately changed from frustrated anger to surprised deference. Whatever his feelings about British protocols and military traditions, he understood that he was now in the presence of one of the world's most respected monarchs. The cameras that had been recording every moment of the confrontation now swung to capture this unexpected royal appearance. "Your Majesty," Trump said, his voice suddenly much more respectful as he executed what he believed to be an appropriate bow. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Queen Elizabeth approached with the dignity and confidence that had made her a global icon for 7 decades. She had chosen to wear one of her favorite brooches, a diamond piece that had belonged to Queen Victoria, as a subtle reminder of the continuity and tradition she represented. "Mr. President," the Queen said in her clear, measured voice, "I understand there has been some confusion about the duties and protocols of my guards. Perhaps I might help clarify the situation." The word "my guards" was delivered with particular emphasis, making it absolutely clear who held ultimate authority over the Queen's Guard. Trump seemed to recognize the significance of this phrasing, and his demeanor shifted noticeably. "Your Majesty, I was simply asking for a basic military courtesy," Trump said, attempting to justify his position. "In America, when the president asks for a salute, military personnel provide one. I thought the same courtesy might apply here." The Queen's response was delivered with the kind of polite firmness that had made her legendary among diplomats and world leaders. She had perfected the art of correction without direct confrontation, and this moment would showcase that skill perfectly. "Mr. President, I appreciate your perspective on military courtesy. However, I believe it's important for you to understand that my guards serve under an oath of loyalty to the Crown that has remained unchanged for centuries. Guardsman Wellington here has sworn to serve me personally, and his protocols reflect that sacred commitment." The phrase, "sacred commitment," was chosen deliberately. The Queen understood that Trump was a person who responded to concepts of loyalty and dedication, and she was framing the guard's behavior in terms that he might better appreciate. "When my guards stand at their posts," the Queen continued, "they are not simply following rules or regulations. They are honoring a tradition that connects them directly to generations of service members who have protected the monarchy through wars, invasions, and countless challenges to our nation's security." Trump listened with obvious attention as the Queen spoke. Her calm authority and the historical weight of her words were having a visible effect on his demeanor. The cameras continued to record every moment, capturing what was becoming a masterclass in diplomatic leadership. "Your Majesty," Trump said, his voice much more subdued than it had been moments earlier, "I certainly don't want to interfere with your traditions. I was simply hoping for some recognition of the office I represent." Queen Elizabeth had anticipated this concern, and she was prepared with a response that would address Trump's need for respect while maintaining the integrity of her guard's protocols. "Mr. President, the respect that Britain has for the United States and for your office is demonstrated in many ways, through our alliance, our cooperation on global challenges, and the honor we show you by welcoming you to my home. But that respect cannot require my guards to abandon the oaths they have sworn or the traditions they are bound to uphold." The Queen's words carried the weight of constitutional principle, wrapped in personal courtesy. She was making it clear that respect and friendship did not require the abandonment of sovereignty or tradition. Captain Ashford watched this exchange with deep admiration for his monarch's handling of the situation. In just a few sentences, she had managed to acknowledge Trump's concerns while firmly establishing the boundaries that could not be crossed. Wellington remained at perfect attention throughout the Queen's intervention, but there was a subtle sense of relief in his bearing. His sovereign had arrived to resolve a situation that had placed him in an impossible position, and she had done so with the grace and authority that made her legendary. Sir Michael Harrington and the other British officials were also visibly relieved. The Queen's appearance had transformed a potentially damaging diplomatic incident into a teachable moment about British constitutional traditions. "I hope, Mr. President," the Queen continued, "that you can appreciate the position my guards find themselves in. Their loyalty to the Crown is absolute, just as I'm sure the loyalty of your military personnel to the United States is absolute. These parallel loyalties should complement rather than conflict with our broader alliance." Trump nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications of what the Queen was explaining. The comparison between British loyalty to the Crown and American military loyalty to the Constitution provided a framework he could better comprehend. "Your Majesty, I think I understand better now," Trump said with what appeared to be genuine humility. "I suppose every military has its own traditions and loyalties that need to be respected." Queen Elizabeth smiled slightly, the kind of gracious expression that had smoothed over countless diplomatic rough patches throughout her reign. "Indeed, Mr. President. And now, perhaps we might proceed with our scheduled discussions. I believe we have much to talk about regarding the continued friendship between our nations." As the Queen turned to lead the way toward the palace entrance, Trump fell into step beside her. The confrontation that had threatened to become a major diplomatic incident was effectively over, resolved by the quiet authority of a monarch who had spent 7 decades mastering the art of leadership. Wellington remained at his post as the group moved away, his perfect military bearing unchanged from the beginning of the encounter. He had successfully maintained his protocols and upheld his oath, protected by the intervention of the sovereign he had sworn to serve. Captain Ashford allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction as he watched the peaceful resolution of what could have been a much more serious situation. The Queen's handling of the incident would become a case study in diplomatic crisis management. The media representatives who had witnessed the entire encounter were already crafting their reports about the morning's events. The story would focus not on confrontation and conflict, but on the graceful way that tradition and diplomacy had triumphed over misunderstanding. As the sun continued to climb in the London sky, Buckingham Palace returned to its normal rhythm of activity. Guards remained at their posts, staff members resumed their duties, and the business of state continued as it had for centuries. The brief storm had passed, leaving behind a renewed appreciation for the strength of traditions that had weathered countless challenges throughout British history. The encounter would be remembered not as a failure of diplomacy, but as a demonstration of how respect, understanding, and firm principle could resolve even the most challenging situations between allies and friends.